Level 0. Every story of disaster has to start somewhere. And in this case, it begins with nothing dramatic at all. Level 0 is what scientists call bankfull stage, when a river is just chilling inside its own boundaries, flowing exactly as nature intended. No sirens, no sandbags, just water doing its 9 to 5 job. This stage might look uneventful, but it's actually the baseline that defines everything else. Hydrologists measure every future flood against this normal flow. Without it, you wouldn't know where safety ends and danger begins. At level 0, the river supports life, nourishes fields, and maybe even gives us a spot to fish or skip rocks. The worst thing you'll face here? Probably a goose with an attitude problem. And believe me, they can be scarier than knee-deep water. But here's the catch. Beneath the calm surface, the river is always storing energy, eroding banks, shifting sediments. It's a system waiting for the right trigger. And once that balance tips, water starts creeping where it doesn't belong. Welcome to Level 1. Level 1. This is the first step where a river starts acting a little suspicious. Level 1, also called minor overflow, is when water creeps just beyond its banks. Not a disaster, but definitely a red flag. You'll see puddles spreading onto sidewalks, park benches half submerged. Scientists track this stage carefully. In the US, the National Weather Service calls it the action stage, not because it's blockbuster movie dramatic, but because emergency crews know it's time to prepare. Sandbags get stacked, floodgates checked, and people downstream start paying attention. It might look harmless at first. A few inches of water across the street doesn't seem like much, right? But here's the catch. Water is sneaky. Once it leaves the river channel, it doesn't always go back. It seeps into basements, weakens foundations, and turns what should be a quick summer rain into thousands of dollars in property damage. Real-world example? In New York City, sudden downpours often push storm drains past capacity, creating knee-deep pools on sidewalks. Harmless for some, but if you've ever lost a shoe in that mess, you know it feels like the river already won. Level 1 might not send anyone running for higher ground, but it's the warning shot. Because once the water starts spreading, the next level doesn't just inconvenience you, it can cut off entire streets. Level 2. Now we're getting into the kind of flood that really disrupts daily life. Level 2 is where water stops being a mild inconvenience and starts taking over streets. Picture this, cars stranded like abandoned toys, headlights just peeking out above murky water, and people wading through knee-deep currents while holding their groceries above their heads. Scientifically, this happens when storm drains and sewage systems can't keep up. Cities are designed to handle a certain amount of runoff, but heavy rainfall, especially in concrete-heavy urban areas, overwhelms the system fast. The result? Roadways transform into rivers, and suddenly your daily commute looks more like a rafting expedition. Take Houston, Texas, for example. In 2016, a series of intense storms dumped more than a foot of rain in just 24 hours. Highways turned into waterways, and thousands of vehicles were left submerged. Insurance companies paid out hundreds of millions in damages, all because water didn't have anywhere else to go. And here's where it gets more serious. Even shallow street flooding can be dangerous. Just a foot of fast-moving water can sweep away a small car. Even 6 inches can knock a grown adult off their feet. Yet every flood season, you'll still see someone testing their luck, driving straight into the water with confidence, only to discover that engines and floods don't mix. At level 2, the danger isn't just property damage, it's mobility. Emergency vehicles can't pass, neighborhoods get cut off, and what looks like just water on the street can quickly trap entire communities. But street flooding is only the beginning, because once the water climbs higher, it stops targeting streets and starts invading homes. That's where level 3 begins. Level 3. At level 3, the water finally crosses a line. It's no longer just sitting on sidewalks or blocking traffic. Now it's invading homes and businesses. Basement flooding is where a flood starts to feel personal. You're not just watching water from your porch anymore. It's seeping through your walls, creeping across the floor, and turning your living space into a shallow pool. Scientifically, this happens when groundwater levels rise faster than drainage systems can handle. Pressure builds, and water forces its way into the lowest points of a building. Basements, underground garages, and subway tunnels. And once it gets inside, it's not just about drying things out. Floodwater often carries silt, sewage, and chemicals, making cleanup both costly and hazardous. Chicago is a city all too familiar with this stage. Heavy spring rains often overwhelm its century-old stormwater system, leaving thousands of residents bailing out basements year after year. Beyond property damage, these floods can spark health crises, mold growth, contaminated drinking water, and the loss of safe shelter for families. The financial toll is staggering. A few inches of water in a basement can cause tens of thousands of dollars in damage. Entire furnaces, electrical systems, and personal belongings can be destroyed in a matter of hours. And unlike street flooding, which eventually drains away, Basement floods often linger, leaving behind long-term structural damage. Level 3 marks the moment where floods stop being a community nuisance and become a direct assault on people's homes. It's a turning point, a reminder that water doesn't need to be deep or dramatic to change lives completely. And as destructive as basement floods can be, the next level is far more sudden and far more deadly. That's where flash floods take over. Level 4. If basement flooding feels like a slow invasion, flash floods are the exact opposite. Sudden, violent, and brutally unforgiving. Level 4 is where water stops creeping and starts attacking. Scientifically, a flash flood occurs when extreme rainfall dumps more water than the ground or drainage systems can absorb. Rivers swell in minutes, dry valleys transform into raging torrents, and walls of water sweep away anything in their path. Unlike other floods, you often get little to no warning. One moment you're driving down a road that looks wet but passable. The next, that same road is gone beneath a roaring current. The 1976 Big Thompson Canyon flood in Colorado is one of the most infamous examples. A sudden thunderstorm dropped over a foot of rain in just a few hours. With nowhere to go, water surged through the canyon at nearly 20 feet high, smashing homes, flipping cars, and leaving more than 140 people dead. Many victims had no chance to react. The water simply came too fast. And this is the terrifying reality of flash floods. Depth doesn't matter. Just 6 inches of fast-moving water can knock you off your feet, and 2 feet can carry away an SUV. Yet every year, countless drivers underestimate the force of these floods, only to find themselves stranded or worse. Level 4 is nature at its most sudden and merciless. It's not just water. It's water with momentum, water with force, water that doesn't give you time to think. And as devastating as flash floods are, they're often just the beginning. Because once rivers rise high enough to breach their levees, entire towns can disappear beneath the surface. That's the nightmare of Level 5. Level 5. If flash floods are sudden explosions of water, river floods are slow, crushing giants. At Level 5, the river swells beyond its banks, overtops levees, and spreads across entire towns. Unlike flash floods, these disasters often unfold over days or even weeks, but their scale makes them far more devastating. Scientifically, this is what hydrologists classify as major flooding, when water overwhelms infrastructure, submerges entire neighborhoods, and forces mass evacuations. It's not just about a single street or basement anymore. It's an entire community underwater. One of the most infamous examples is the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. Weeks of relentless rain pushed the river to heights no one had ever seen. Levees burst in dozens of places, drowning an area roughly the size of South Carolina. Hundreds of thousands were displaced, many permanently. The disaster reshaped not only the Mississippi Delta, but also U.S. flood policy, forcing the government to rethink how rivers were controlled. And history repeated itself decades later. In 1993, another record flood along the Mississippi lasted nearly 6 months, submerging towns, destroying crops, and costing billions in damages. Entire stretches of highway were erased, and in some areas, the river carved entirely new channels through farmland. The terrifying thing about river floods is their persistence. Streets stay underwater for weeks, foundations crumble, and survivors face long recoveries even after the water recedes. The disaster doesn't end when the rain stops. It lingers in every ruined building and every family forced to start over. Level 5 is where floods stop being events and become eras. And yet, as overwhelming as river floods are, they don't even compare to what happens when entire cities vanish beneath the waterline. That's the grim reality of Level 6. Level 6 is where flooding stops being a disaster for towns and turns into a catastrophe for entire cities. This is urban submergence, when vast metro areas with millions of people are swallowed by water for days, weeks, or even months. At this stage, it's not just about property loss. It's about the collapse of systems that modern life depends on. Electricity, clean water, hospitals, transportation, even food supply. The most haunting modern example is Hurricane Katrina in 2005. When the levees failed, nearly 80% of New Orleans went underwater. Whole neighborhoods vanished, cars floated down streets like debris, and families were stranded on rooftops waiting for rescue. Power was knocked out, hospitals were overwhelmed, and thousands were left trapped in the sweltering Superdome with little food or clean water. More than 1,800 people lost their lives, and the scars on the city are still visible today. Urban submergence also struck Bangkok in 2011, when months of rainfall flooded industrial zones, crippling global supply chains. Factories producing everything from cars to electronics were forced offline, sending ripple effects around the world. What makes Level 6 so terrifying is the scale of recovery. Cities are engines of entire nations, and when they drown, the damage spreads far beyond the flood zone. Infrastructure must be rebuilt, economies stall, and people face years before life feels normal again. At this level, floods don't just destroy homes, they paralyze entire civilizations. And if an entire city underwater feels unimaginable, level 7 raises the stakes even higher, dragging whole regions into chaos. Level 7. Level 7 is where flooding stops being a local or city crisis and engulfs entire regions. At this stage, millions of people can be displaced, farmlands vanish, and national governments declare emergencies. The damage isn't just physical, it ripples through economies, food supplies, and public health on a massive scale. One of the starkest examples comes from Pakistan in 2010. Unrelenting monsoon rains triggered floods that submerged one-fifth of the entire country. That's an area larger than England. Rivers spilled over, dams failed, and villages disappeared beneath brown, churning water. Around 20 million people were directly affected, with homes destroyed, crops wiped out, and outbreaks of disease following in the flood's wake. The disaster required one of the largest humanitarian responses in history. A similar nightmare struck Bangladesh in 1998 when floods covered more than two-thirds of the nation. Tens of millions were stranded. Rice crops, the lifeblood of the country, were decimated, and international aid was the only thing preventing famine. Scientifically, these floods happen when monsoons, swollen rivers, and infrastructure collapse overlap. Unlike city submergence, regional floods stretch for hundreds of miles. Roads vanish, power grids fail, and entire provinces become isolated islands surrounded by water. At this scale, recovery is measured not in months, but in years. Food prices skyrocket, jobs are lost, and displaced families may never return home. The floods reshape the very geography and economy of a nation. Level 7 is the point where a flood stops being a natural disaster and becomes a humanitarian catastrophe. And as unimaginable as this sounds, history proves there are even deadlier, larger floods ahead. Level 8 is where we enter the era of true megafloods. Level 8. At level 8, we leave behind disasters that affect millions and step into the territory of megafloods, catastrophic events so large they rewrite history. These are not seasonal storms or isolated tragedies. They're continent-shaping, population-crushing floods that leave entire nations scarred. The most infamous example is China's 1931 floods, often described as the deadliest natural disaster of the 20th century. Triggered by a brutal combination of snowmelt, relentless rain, and overflowing rivers like the Yangtze and Huai, the water swallowed towns and farmland across a region the size of several European countries. Conservative estimates suggest over 2 million lives were lost, though some historians argue the toll was far higher. Beyond the immediate deaths, famine and disease spread for months, amplifying the devastation. Megafloods have struck elsewhere too. In 1887, another disaster along the Yellow River killed close to 1 million people after levees collapsed. The river earned the grim nickname China's Sorrow because its floods reshaped dynasties and toppled governments. Scientifically, megafloods are fueled by extreme climate cycles or long-term weather anomalies. When rain continues for months, rivers rise beyond all control, and human engineering, levees, dams, canals, simply fails. The water doesn't just flood streets. It erases landscapes, redraws coastlines, and destroys entire agricultural systems. What makes level 8 so terrifying isn't just the death toll, it's the scale of collapse. Governments falter, economies shatter, and survivors face famine, displacement, and generational trauma. These are the kinds of floods that shape history books and folklore alike. And if megafloods sound apocalyptic already, level 9 takes us into even more destructive territory. Sudden, unstoppable walls of water unleashed by glaciers or failed dams. Level 9. Level 9 is where floods transform from creeping disasters into sudden cataclysms. These are glacial, outburst floods and dam failures. Events where water isn't just rising slowly, but exploding into motion with unstoppable force. Glacial outbursts, known as jökullaups in Iceland, happen when ice dams holding back enormous lakes suddenly collapse. The release is violent, billions of gallons of water crashing downstream in minutes. During the Ice Age, repeated outbursts from ancient Lake Missoula unleashed torrents that carved canyons across the Pacific Northwest, reshaping entire landscapes into what we now call the channeled scablands. These were not just floods, they were geologic bulldozers. Man-made dams are just as vulnerable. In 1975, China's Banqiao Dam failed after a typhoon dumped a year's worth of rain in a single day. The wall of water tore through Henan province, wiping out villages in seconds. Estimates suggest over 170,000 people died, not just from the flood itself, but from famine and disease in the weeks that followed. It remains one of the deadliest dam disasters in history. The terrifying reality of level 9 floods is their speed. Unlike river floods that give hours or days of warning, these events strike in an instant. One moment, a valley is calm. The next, it's obliterated by a wall of water taller than buildings and faster than a sprinting human. There is no escape if you're in its path. These floods remind us that human engineering and natural ice barriers are fragile against nature's pressure. When they fail, the destruction is immediate, total, and merciless. And yet, even these nightmare scenarios aren't the end. Level 10 takes us to the ultimate scale, not just regional devastation, but the possibility of a global deluge. Level 10. At level 10, we've reached the ultimate flood. Not a city, not a country, but the entire planet drowning beneath water. This is the global deluge, where coastlines vanish. Civilizations collapse and the map of Earth itself is rewritten. Stories of world-engulfing floods echo across cultures. From Noah's Ark in the Bible to the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity has long feared the idea of everything being washed away. For ancient people, floods were so destructive that they became myths of survival and rebirth. But behind the myths lies science. If Greenland's ice sheet melted entirely, global sea levels would rise by around 7 meters. Add Antarctica's ice, and we're talking about a staggering 65 meters. That's enough to drown every coastal city on Earth, from New York to Shanghai, and force billions inland. The result wouldn't be a sudden wall of water, but a slow-motion catastrophe, one that would reshape nations, economies, and daily life forever. And history shows Earth has already lived through such cataclysms. At the end of the last ice age, melting glaciers raised sea levels by more than 400 feet. Entire land bridges vanished. Places like Doggerland in northern Europe, once home to human settlements, now lie beneath the North Sea. Level 10 floods are apocalyptic not just for the scale of water, but for what follows. Famine, migration, wars over shrinking land, and the collapse of modern civilization. This is the flood that turns cities into ruins and continents into archipelagos. It's the nightmare scenario, the flood that humanity could not simply rebuild from. And while it might sound like legend, climate science warns us, pieces of this future are already in motion.